Cities virtual conference, jointly organised by the UN Habitat and the Global Conference for Mayors for Climate and Energy. It's a pleasure to have you join us today, and I hope you will leave invigorated by new ideas and questions on the central theme of this session in the conference programme, namely decarbonisation and the role of technology. I'm Robert Hall, Director of Strategy at a business-led organisation called Resilience First. A Resilience First mission is to help build resilience across business communities, whether those communities be defined by geography or special interest. Please do visit our website, resilience1st.co.uk, to see the many projects and events we organise in an effort to help your understanding and application of resilience. We have recently formed a strategic partnership with the Resilience Shift organisation, so both our reach and output have expanded for the greater good. I will be acting as your chairman for this session, and we have up to an hour and a half to explore our central theme, and we will do this with the help of 3 experts. I will later introduce them and their chosen topics to you. And after the presentations, we will have a panel discussion, and then I hope to be able to introduce some questions from you, the audience. Hence, please do post your questions in the chat facility, and I will try to voice as many as I can in the time we have available. If there are any immediate and brief questions to a speaker on a point of clarification, then I will pose this to the relevant speaker after their presentation. The session will be recorded and the slides used will be made available subsequently. But before we hear from the speakers, allow me a few moments to introduce the subject we have to illuminate. Now, Resilience First, in partnership with Intel, published a report in July this year on the title of Decarbonisation and the Role of Technology. This followed a series of webinars on the same topic, each of which looked at a specific industry sector, namely rail, aviation, manufacturing, and energy, and its ability to decarbonisation through 4 principal measures: adaptation, greater energy efficiency, the use of renewables, and carbon capture. I also hope the report will be made available to you to read at your leisure after this event. The recommendations we made in the report were threefold. First, more investment should be made in innovation to drive technologies that will help speed up carbon emission reductions. Second, more investment would be directed at job upskilling and employment transition. And third, more cross-silo working is encouraged, both top-down and bottom-up, in order to deploy faster, more resilient, and more universal technologies. I've asked each of our 3 speakers today to include comments on these recommendations in their respective presentations. Underpinning these recommendations is the belief that industry and business across all sectors have a role to play in finding technological solutions and in adapting their systems and processes to meet the carbon reduction targets. When one considers the fact that in the UK, and I'm sure many other countries are similar, around 80% of the so-called critical national infrastructure, covering in our case 13 sectors that include items like food, energy, transport, health and security, is in the hands of the private sector, then we need, therefore, to have good public-private partnerships and excellent cross-silo working in tackling climate change. And technology can help us on that journey, as you will soon hear. I would remind you, however, of Amara's law. I don't know whether you've heard of Amara's law, but it states that we overestimate the impact of technology in the short term, underestimate the effect in the long term. I've asked, therefore, that our speakers consider the challenges faced by business to advance a climate resilient strategy, as well as explore other possible areas of interventions, including skills, the role of policymakers, and better deployment of existing innovative solutions to deliver decarbonisation. This may help to highlight business engagement opportunities in the new IPCC reports, which are due out in Easter next year. Now, I hope this backcloth gives you some feeling of the direction of travel of this session, and you feel invigorated by continuing to listen to us. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, and I will then introduce the others as they come to speak. Now, Andy Walker is the Technical Marketing Director of NAFI, a company that specializes in sustainable technologies and the application of cutting-edge science to create solutions for customers across the world. Andy contributed to the section in our report titled Setting the Green Scene, and hence is well placed to begin our session today and give us an overview of the issues and potential quick wins from technology. Andy, the virtual floor is yours.
Robert, thank you very much indeed. Just bear with 1 second, let me put my camera on. There we go. Apologies for that. Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, Robert, for the introduction. What I'm going to do over the next 10 minutes or so is give really a high-level introduction to the role of technology in decarbonisation in a number of sectors, as well as building on a number of points that Robert has made around some of the quick wins that we can see, but also some of the major challenges. And really to start by setting the scene on the global megatrends which are shaping our world now. So we've got the climate change emergency, which leads to the need for the clean energy transition. Part of that is the transformation of mobility away from using fossil fuels towards using, for example, electricity and hydrogen. As we go through this transformation, we'll hit some resource challenges around certain critical raw materials, which we can certainly explore in the panel discussion afterwards, and of course looking at personal health, longevity and things like that. And really running across these, we've got the digital revolution, which will enable and accelerate some of these aspects. But the key thing is that there's a lack of clarity at the moment in terms of exactly which way the world's going to move. And many of us are hoping that COP26, the upcoming Conference of the Parties in Glasgow next month, will really start to provide additional focus and additional impetus behind the clean energy transition. I think there's grounds for optimism. 46 countries and states globally have now defined dates to become net zero. So this is fantastic. And almost 80% of global GDP has got net zero targets. And just 2 years ago, that was just 16%. So a big acceleration in commitment of countries around the world to move towards net zero, ideally by 2050, in the case of China a little later, before 2060. But all of this is really going to help as we look to combat climate change and its impact. And the great thing in many ways is that COVID-19 hasn't slowed this trend. If anything, what we're seeing in a number of the Building Back Greener government policies is a strong focus on the money that's being made available to industry and more broadly going towards the promoting the green topics and accelerating the mitigation of climate change. But we've got a big challenge ahead of us. We want to get onto this 1.5 degree C trajectory that we can see down here, the bottom one here. As we look at the global greenhouse gas emissions, historically we can see that they've been going up. And really what we need to do to get onto this 1.5 degree C path, we need greenhouse gas emissions to fall by around 45% over the next 10 years. So I think there's two big messages that this gives. One is that we've got to start deploying today what we have and learn by doing, and that will drive innovation. The other is, as we move through the next 10 years, we've got to make sure that we're investing in green technologies, investing in all the approaches that we have at our disposal to bring down the net greenhouse gas emissions so that we can limit global temperatures to the lowest possible value above pre-industrial levels. And 1.5 degrees C is the target from the IPCC and many policymakers. Another key point that Robert made is cross-sector coupling, the need to get sectors to work together on this and break down silos. And this is just one scenario from the European Commission as to how the EU could move towards a net zero community. And essentially what you can see is all of the sectors have got to contribute. I think, when you look at, for example, transport and power, these are two at the leading edge and they work critically together. There's no point in buying a battery electric car if it's being powered by electricity generated in a coal-fired power plant. That's not helping the CO2 emissions of the planet. So the power sector needs to decarbonize in order to get most of the benefits from the transport sector, new technologies and the decarbonisation within that. But the critical thing with this, and it doesn't matter how quickly each of the respective sectors moves, all the sectors have got to move together. And I think the other critical thing is this talk about net zero. We're not going to be able to see, or we're not going to be able to get all of the sectors to absolute zero emissions. Things like agriculture is not going to get to zero anytime soon. Things like aviation, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So what we can see is we need to net off the existing emissions in 2050, balance those with things like land use changes, things like planting trees, and things like carbon capture and storage, which Robert also mentioned in his introduction. Increases in energy efficiency will play a role, and there's a number of quick wins there. But the critical thing is the deployment of what we can do today, because it's all about the area under the curve. So the sooner we start to act, the better. And the deployment and development of future low carbon technology will play a major role. And this can only happen with an upskilled workforce, both to develop and to implement these new technologies. So it comes back to a circular argument here. So how we're going to do this, one of the things that's going to play a really, really big role is clean electricity. So renewable electricity, wind power, solar power, etc. If you can electrify it and it makes sense, then you should definitely do it because it's usually the most energy efficient route. So things like light duty transport, we'll see electrification there. We've already got the increases in battery electric vehicles, most rail applications. Many homes homes and businesses will be heated using renewable electricity, and some light industrial processes. And as we look at potential quick wins within light duty transport, increasing the efficiency of cars with internal combustion engines, the car companies have been doing that for many, many years, and they should continue because an internal combustion engine powered car that goes on the road today will still be on the road in 10 years and likely still in 15 years. So these will have a long-term impact on the overall CO2 footprint. We can also increase the proportion of sustainable fuel use, and a number of governments worldwide are starting to do that so that the fuels that are used have got a lower carbon footprint. And then, of course, moving to what will largely be battery electric vehicles in the transport sector. Easy wins in heating homes and businesses. Let's insulate our buildings better. This really does have a significant impact. And as we look at cross-sector collaboration in this space, light-duty transport and the power sector need to work together. So within light-duty transport, we look for smart charging so that vehicles are not all charged at 5 or 6 o'clock when we get home from work. That would put a tremendous strain on the grid. So smart charging to enable, and with digital technology to ensure that people are generally charging overnight will make sense. And then you've also got the possibility of vehicles, when they are connected to the charge point, enabling electrons to move in both directions so that you can help with the pool of electric vehicles that are connected to the network, you can help with grid demand at peak time. So again, a number of cross-sector opportunities there for us. Alongside renewable energy, we'll see clean hydrogen playing a critical role, because there's a number of applications where renewable electricity is not the best solution. Things like aviation, for example, because the energy density, the energy you can store in a battery is not enough to enable you to fly, for example, halfway around the world. So we need alternative approaches for a number of sectors that are shown here. And this hydrogen will either be produced from electrolysis, again using renewable electricity, or by steam methane reforming, a very well established industrial technology today, with carbon capture and storage, which again, Robert mentioned in the interim. And here we'll see fuel switching for high energy intensive industries. So when you've got to generate a lot of temperature to drive a process, electricity is often not the most efficient way to do that. So fuel switching from using natural gas, obviously its combustion produces CO2, switching to clean hydrogen is one thing that we'll see industrially. Heavy duty transport, so long haul transportation, we'll see fuel cell powered trucks running on hydrogen. And in the marine case, we'll start to see engines which will be powered by green ammonia, again, generated from green hydrogen, and green methanol, also generated from green hydrogen. So these fuels can be combusted and you end up with a strongly minimized carbon footprint associated with the marine sector, for example, and some of the other sectors we'll explore during the panel discussion. So the key message is, the final slide here, we need to invest in people and innovation if we're going to stand a chance of achieving what we've just looked at over the course of the next 30 years. We need to break down silos between all of the sectors to find optimum solutions. And of course, we need to move quickly. In order to get onto that 1.5 degree C path that I showed at the start of the presentation, we've got to start deploying what we can today, learn by doing, and that will help drive further innovation in addition to the other innovative technologies that we're going to be working on over the course of the next 10 to 15 years. So with that, I'll finish my contribution and hand back to Robert.
Thank you very much, Andy. That was a very clear expose and very positive one, and I look forward to challenging and discussing some of the ideas you raised. So thank you very much. We'll now move on to our second speaker. Caroline Field is the energy sector lead at the Resilient Shift and an associate director at the engineering company Arup. And I have just lost my screen. Caroline will be introducing a topic, as you see on the screen, of technology and the urban energy transition. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Caroline.
Morning, thank you, Robert. Great to be here. I had a few technical difficulties earlier, so I'm glad that I've made it. As Robert mentioned, I'm an associate director at Arup. I'm also a visiting professor at Loughborough University. I tend to talk more about resilience, but obviously decarbonisation, resilience, all very, very much in the same area. So today I'll be talking about technology and the urban energy transition. So I guess the first question is, why cities? And I think it's probably obvious to most of us that, you know, so many people are living in cities now. We have 70% of the world's population will live in cities by 2050. 75% of the world's energy is consumed in cities, and 80% of the world's greenhouse gases are produced by cities. And obviously, cities are the social and spatial framework for most people's lives. This concentration of people, infrastructure, businesses, and institutions creates a focal point for both risks and opportunities. And so when shocks do occur, they disrupt the continuity of services that most people take for granted. And they can be very uneven in their impact, hitting the most disadvantaged and vulnerable hardest. And so we're living in this increasingly dynamic and changing world, as we've all noticed, evidenced by the last 18 months. And, you know, climate change is very much associated with this increased frequency and severity of extreme weather, high summer temperatures, which can tip into kind of periods of acute and lethal heat stress, which we're seeing in our cities, which can be exacerbated by energy and transport disruptions, racing social tensions, and obviously large regional inequalities exacerbate those types of shocks. But obviously stresses can be a source of advantage, and technology is one of those. So obviously we're in a period of rapidly changing technology, and if that is exploited correctly, that can definitely bring new industries and prosperity to cities. So I just wanted to I mentioned resilience, but I wanted to I really like this image, and this was one that Joe De Silva from Arup did actually a couple of years ago, and it was really talking about these linked agendas towards sustainable development. And so we have the three core: resilient, sustainable, and digital, and then people-centered in the middle. But this all sits in this framework of systems thinking, which Andy mentioned, this need to de-silo, so systems, not silos. And this is really needed for us to come together and really focus on sustainable development. So as we've talked about, so technology can certainly enhance decarbonisation and resilience, and we'll talk about how I'll go through a few areas where certainly we can see that. But what I will say is, obviously we do need to be aware when we're using technology, we're also that we don't create vulnerabilities within our systems. Obviously, the more that we're automated, the more we may be vulnerable to cyber attack, and so we just need to be really aware of where we're potentially creating those vulnerabilities when we're using technology. I wanted to go over this slide because about a year ago, with the Resilient Shift, we did a survey, a global survey looking at the energy sector. So understanding essentially what were the key issues, and so obviously decarbonisation, you see in the middle there, came up really as a key issue and driver for the sector. And then we talked about what are those barriers that are in the way, what are the opportunities, and what can we do at Resilient Shift to actually help with that. And you can see the different areas that came up here, quite a broad areas. And I know Andy's touched on some of this already. Obviously technology and data in the bottom left there, and I'll talk a bit more about these technologies that can really enable that transition. We also talked about being able to quantify resilience being a really important area. The structure of the industry, being able to bring in new technologies and encouraging new companies to come in the sector. Right now, regulation can be a barrier to that. And so having more agile regulation is really important, and having the right financial models to incentivize that innovation to come into the sector. So lots of really interesting things that need to change in order to enable this shift and enable the technology that we need. So I was going to talk through a few obviously key areas for in general, but obviously specific to cities. And so obviously energy is one of those really big areas for everything. And so modern society has been very much built around this foundation of abundant and affordable grid supplied energy generated primarily from fossil fuels, and that foundation is now shifting in complex ways. So obviously we have aging infrastructure and increasing extreme weather events, which make supply more vulnerable, and obviously decarbonisation is promoting this transition to renewables, but the intermittent nature of renewables is generating a greater need for storage. And so, and distributed systems are adding complexity to this previously centralized system. So we're blurring those lines between end users and grid operators. And as boundaries between energy, transport and water and digitalization are increasingly intertwined, changes in one part of that system can have a rippling effect in other parts of systems. And so this systems thinking is really needed. So the scope of this change will be larger than anything the energy sector has ever experienced, with huge shifts in infrastructure, operation and regulation, as I touched on. But the potential for cleaner, greener and more responsive energy system is very real. But through that transition, we need to be really aware of potential disruption, stranded assets and overburdened communities. And so creating a system that's resilient is incredibly important. So we've been very much promoting this need to be resilient during the energy transition. So a few of those technologies we're obviously looking at the moment that we're definitely going to be needing. So obviously sustainable energy generation, storage and demand management that Andy touched on as well, really important and really will enable the transition in the energy sector. I was just going to share with you, we've been doing some work with the city of Rotterdam on they've put together an energy transition strategy, and we've been supporting them in terms of making sure that transition is resilient. And so Rotterdam, in 2030, their CO2 emissions will be 49% lower than in 1990, and in 2050 they'll be climate neutral. And so they're adjusting, obviously massive adjustment in their energy system, and that new system will be more diverse, complex, smarter, and more decentralized. So obviously there's that potential for it to lead to greater vulnerabilities, but also really positive in terms of opportunities to be more self-sufficient and less dependent. So what they've actually been looking at, so they've got obviously a big port city, so they've been looking at using the heat that's generated at the port to heat their district heating network. So that's kind of one kind of system, renewable system that they're using. But obviously that's not, you know, resilient in and of itself. You want to have a backup. So they're also looking at geothermal energy in terms of that part of that system as well. So they're going through that transition at the moment, and we're advising them on kind of keeping it redundant and diverse and making sure they can be resilient during that transition. And the framework here is we've been using the Arab resilience framework, energy resilience framework, to look at gaps in resilience, so we can baseline now and then look at kind of as they transition, how that changes, and where they need to focus and to make sure that they maintain resilience throughout. Obviously, the second big area for cities is buildings. And so energy use in buildings accounts for the majority of greenhouse gas emissions in most cities, and is a significant source of air pollution. And existing buildings often have the biggest opportunities because there's a lot that can be done to improve them. And we always use the energy, this is our energy hierarchy diagram. So the first thing we want to do is sort of reduce energy, and then improve energy efficiency, and then obviously bringing in renewables. So we tend to work through that sort of hierarchy when we're working on projects to improve things. So we can improve energy efficiency of these buildings through retrofitting, so new insulation cladding, replacement windows, replacing building services, and obviously when we're thinking about obviously new buildings, which will have a lifetime of 30 to 50 years, it's really important that they're designed, built, and operated in a way that minimizes emissions embodied in the materials, but also during the construction, but also emissions during operation and use. So high performance in new buildings and existing buildings, energy should be supplied by obviously low carbon and renewable means, utilizing waste heat through heating and cooling networks, or employing ground or air source heat pumps, or utilizing sort of wind and solar voltaics. So there needs to be some kind of obviously incentives for us to kind of make that switch. And obviously hydrogen is another area that's being explored in terms of switching from sort of gas across to hydrogen. There are also, just to mention, in terms of, there are other promising technologies in terms of building materials, so obviously reducing kind of the three kind of top emitting industries: cement, iron and steel, and chemicals. So there's obviously technology comes in there to help reduce those embodied, the embodied carbon and all of those materials. And technology is also improving efficiency in design and manufacture, driving reductions in material waste, substituting low carbon for high carbon, or high carbon for low carbon materials, and promoting circular economy, which I think we'll hear more about in a bit. So I just wanted to show, we're doing a project in, one of my colleagues is doing a project in LA for SoCal Edison. So we're looking at essentially the transition to an electrified portfolio of buildings. And so we've been doing quite a detailed study. So we've been looking at essentially what's the pathway and how do we make that resilient and equitable. So looking at that kind of point of equity in terms of the transition to making sure that people are not left behind. And so we've been looking at the different building types and looking at how that can be achieved, and what technologies need to be employed to do that. Transport is obviously the third area, and again we have kind of a hierarchy here of this is our sustainable transport model. So obviously transport is the fastest growing source of emissions in most cities and one of the leading sources of air pollution, and so in terms of reductions, this can be achieved by shifting trips to zero and low carbon modes such as walking and cycling, and mass transit, and improving the efficiency of remaining fleets. So zero emissions vehicles, whether it's sort of via electrification or use of hydrogen, and also ensuring that the transport infrastructure is resilient to the impacts of climate change. And so technologies that obviously we're looking at here is obviously that shift to electric and or hydrogen public transport, the deployment of electric vehicles, and obviously having the infrastructure to support that is incredibly important, and that's definitely a challenge at the moment. And then on the right there, we mentioned the aviation industry. We've done some work actually looking at decarbonising kind of airports in the aviation industry, and obviously, we're looking forward, 2030, so to sustainable aviation fuels being more widespread, and then obviously alternative fuel aircraft, whether it's electric or other, sort of around sort of 2030, 2040. So there's lots of really interesting technologies that are really going to help us get to zero emissions. And so we did this technology timeline for an airport client, because we were kind of looking at how do we decarbonize, what's coming in, what can we use. And so this was kind of, we were sort of looking at, obviously electric airside vehicles, hydrogen airside vehicles, energy storage being a really key, generating on site, solar PV, wind generation, and a lot of airports actually parking is a big revenue, part of their revenue. And so kind of the shift to EVs and potentially being kind of an EV hub or, a charging hub, for example, will be important. And then obviously the emissions for airports, obviously the aircraft are the biggest part of that. And so the sooner we can switch to sustainable aviation fuels, and then obviously to hydrogen or alternative fuel planes, the better. And so this was quite useful in having that conversation with them in terms of explaining the sort of technologies that would be deployable over the next 30 years. And just to sort of last couple of slides, this is actually an Intel slide that they let me borrow. It was a couple of years ago, but I thought it was relevant because it was pre-COVID, and it was just at that time just how much data we're generating in cities and allowing us to kind of monitor all of these things. And that's a really important part, actually, is being able to have that awareness of what's actually going on and be able to monitor our systems and progress. And as you can see here, so much data we're collecting now in terms of building data, infrastructure, utilities, transportation. So it's obviously just going to get more and more, and obviously being able to manage that data and use it usefully and not be vulnerable to attack is the other thing. And then sort of lastly here, the future here is really around digital twins, and we're seeing a lot more of this. This is the Arab Neuron platform, and we've been looking at digital twins for, this is a city, but it's actually just a number of buildings that are connected. And so we can use this to monitor our energy usage and make our buildings more efficient. And so this is really sort of the future in terms of technology, and being able to really design our infrastructure and buildings, virtually test them, and then obviously monitor them as we go forward. So, obviously cities play a critical role in responding to global threats such as climate and ecological emergency, but they also need to face these challenges while also responding to day-to-day needs of their residents, ensuring that investments return tangible benefits and that benefits are felt equitably. And so technology that certainly has a place in supporting decarbonisation and resilience across all of these sectors. But we need to ensure it's not technology for the sake of technology, but it clearly responds to these critical climate change drivers and opportunities, and it doesn't create more vulnerabilities in these, interconnected systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline, very much. And I'm delighted that you were able to resolve your personal technology problems to talk about technology. So well done. Thank you. Let's move on to our next and final speaker. Nawaz Mohammed is a partner with PricewaterhouseCoopers, one of the big four accountancy companies, but it's in the Middle Eastern practice. Again, lost my screen here. Nawaz, never mind. He's been contributing to a circular economy, and his topic is going to be the rise of circularity. So, Nawaz, over to you.
Thank you, Robert. Sorry for taking your screen off for a minute.
Right.
Apologies for that. Yeah, thank you for this. So I'm going to talk for the next 10 minutes on the rise of what is circularity, the importance of circularity in the clean world and the support it's providing towards having a green environment. So basically, initially, I'll talk a little bit about the GCC context as well. So just to introduce, as Robert said, I'm Mohammed Nayaz. I'm a partner in PwC. I kind of I'm involved in resilience engagements, largely in the GCC region. So I'll have a little bit of a GCC flavor to what I talk. So basically, in this presentation, I'll talk about circularity and overview of that, the benefits circularity brings to companies, and outline around 6 steps which organizations need to take in order to kind of follow a circular approach to achieving a circular economy. I think one thing we need to also understand is that the gravity of the problem that we have on hand, because since industrialization in the past 30 years, the amount of resources that we have consumed as part of industrialization, etc. So experts forecast that by 2050, one Earth will not be enough to meet the resource requirements as part of industrial growth. You need to have 2 Earths to meet this. So obviously that's not possible. So we need to look at a solution. The problem is grave. And from a GCC context, it's also a bit more important because there are a few factors from the GCC that impact this, the consumption of energy. The one is there's a low cost of energy in GCC as compared to the rest of the world. There is also a lot of, there's no scarcity of non-renewable energy. Fossil fuels are available in this part of the world. And also the government encourages consumption of energy by providing subsidies. So because of this, there's been a huge consumption of energy, and in fact, amongst the GCC countries such as UAE, including Dubai, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, all these countries fall among the bottom 10 in terms of the worst countries with respect to emission per capita. Okay, so we're already seeing the consequences of these actions through climate change, depletion of the ozone layer, and also the rising sea levels. This puts countries at direct risk through higher temperatures, declining rainfall, and other impacts of the climate change. One of the government committees in the GCC, in particular in Bahrain, they have mentioned that, or rather, they predicted that even with the most conservative sea level rise scenario, we put 5% of the country of Bahrain, which is along the coast, 5% of the country to be underwater within a span of 80 years. So we're not setting a good example for our future generations. So something needs to be done to kind of address this. It's not so grim, particularly in the GCC. What we see is, UAE has been the first country to kind of sign. In fact, you must have seen in the news a couple of days back, the ruler has kind of signed off on the net zero commitment for UAE by 2050. And also those who have kind of visited or seen about Expo 2020 in Dubai that's happening currently, they are very much supportive to a sustainable environment. And some of the buildings that they have built are actually self-sustainable, which means they are at net zero in terms of energy and also net zero in terms of water consumption. So which is fantastic, which is I'd say path-breaking and for many of the other countries and organizations to follow. Right. So in this backdrop, right, so as the world attempts to address the causes of climate change before it's too late, there's a growing consensus worldwide that the answer lies in circularity, right? That's a solution. So what is circularity? It's about decoupling economic activity, as you can see in my slide. It's about decoupled economic activity from the consumption of materials and energy by creating closed loop cycles in which waste is minimized or eliminated and resources are reused. Okay, in simpler words, it's a model of production and consumption which involves sharing, leasing, reusing, repairing, refurbishing, recycling of your existing materials and products as long as possible. So you don't have to every time go for a fresh raw material or a fresh input to your production, you could perhaps use recycled, reused material in order to kind of make this happen. In particularly for the energy and utility sector, it contributes around 14% of the greenhouse gas emissions, and certain other sectors which are heavy in terms of contributing towards the carbon emissions. It's important to follow a circularity principle. So getting into a little bit more on what is circularity, it has, as you can see in my slide, it's embodied upon 3 main principles. So I'll go through each one of them in a minute. And also it has about 10 strategies which needs to be adapted, as you can see. The first principle that it comprises of is on renewable inputs are prioritized. So you kind of, in your production, in your manufacturing, when you look at the inputs for your raw material, etc., you look at or you prioritize inputs on renewable inputs where possible. Okay? This is achieved through circular sourcing. It's also a concept that's catching up amongst the manufacturing sector, which is to look at reused materials for your production capability. Sustainable design of the product, which means when you design a product, you make sure that it's designed in terms of various components, so that when there's a question of replacing some component with a used component, you could do that. So it's built into the design, and also by optimizing resource efficiency. So which means with limited resources, you can get maximum output. So you kind of fine tune on that, which is a concept which our manufacturing sector has and other sectors have considerably matured on. So we kind of look to optimize the resource efficiency, for example, through the use of renewable energy and sustainable sources of raw materials. So that's the first principle of circularity. The second one is to maximize the product use. It means the lifespan and the usage of products is maximized in order to extract the highest possible value. Okay? In production, this involves maybe switching to a product as a service, which is again a concept which should catch up, which is not caught up as much, but in a circular economy, you need to look at product not just as a product supply, one-time supply, and then walk out. You look at providing product as a service. So like what you have to give a simple example, you have Uber. So you have, instead of owning cars, you get cars as a service. So similarly, you apply that concept to the production environment. Like what I understand is that at Schiphol Airport, the lighting is provided by Philips, and that's not provided just by product supply. It's provided as a product as a service, so lighting as a service. So all the lights are owned by Philips. They take charge of maintenance, reuse, etc. So at the end of the day, the airport gets that particular service from Philips from them. So that's something to look at as an innovative way of sourcing in terms of leasing, reuse, share, sold back, etc. So look at innovative methods of maximizing product use where possible. So in production, in consumption rather, this means that the products are reused, product uses are optimized, and sharing of products is encouraged. And the third principle is to recover byproducts and recover waste as well. So this includes refurbishing or manufacturing the product at the end of its life, recycling it back into the production line, and reusing the byproducts of manufacturing. So the good news is that these principles can also be applied to linear manufacturing entities such as oil and gas, utilities, energy sector, so on and so forth. Okay, so with obviously the senior management leadership, commitment, etc. So it's not something that's impossible to achieve. So this will go a long way in terms of meeting the net zero commitments which the various countries have signed up on as part of the agreement. Right. So while circularity is centered on 3 overarching principles, there are also about 10 strategies that you see on the right-hand side of this slide. So which is kind of elaborated in the following slide. So as you can see, in terms of the first principle of prioritizing renewable inputs, there are 3 initiatives that you have in terms of circular sourcing, which is to replace finite resources with renewable or bio-based or recycled materials. Sustainable design as a strategy, which is to design products and select raw materials such that they can be effectively disassembled and then reassembled and reused. And also to improve the efficiency of resources, which is to optimize optimize the input in order to get a better output on this as part of the production process. As part of the second principle, which is the maximizing product use, there are about 4 strategies on that, which is product as a service, as I mentioned before, provide a service in areas that were traditionally sold as products. So there used to be a linear situation where you purchase the material, get it through the manufacturing process, and get the output, and then use it and then throw it, or make it like a linear, instead of a linear model, you look as a product as a service model in various instances in the production unit, for example. Sharing and virtualizing is a strategy as well, where you share durable assets such as cars, rooms, as Caroline mentioned, in terms of from a transport perspective, sharing of assets, the appliances, digitized products to increase their lifetime. Vessel pooling is an example of sharing of assets amongst operators, not just from a car's perspective, also from an industry perspective. You have industrial equipment being provided as a shared model or pooling across multiple operators, especially in the oil and gas, for example, or utility, for example. So applying that concept on would improve the circularity. The usage optimization and maintenance, so increase performance, efficiency of a product, and prolong life through maintenance, and reuse and redistribution. So that's another strategy that you have for maximizing product use. And the third principle in terms of recovering byproducts and waste, and the strategy that you can adapt here for the manufacturing units are to refurbish, remanufacture products by a new usage instead of down recycling. Industrial symbiosis, which is the output of one entity goes into as input as the other entities, enhancing that symbiosis, seamless integration the manufacturing process across multiple industries. Recycling from manufacturing, waste or byproducts from manufacturing becomes the input for another product, and recycling from consumption, so recycle discarded materials after the end of consumption. So these are some of the strategies and principles that underpin the circularity concept, or applying the circularity in an organization. So an example I mentioned before, this is a sustainability pavilion in Expo 2020 in Dubai. You see a solar panel, the huge solar panel, and then you have solar trees which capture solar energy, because in this part of the world the solar energy is abundant. So kind of leveraging that, and also using a concept so that you achieve the net zero energy and net zero from a water perspective as well. So this is example. So this concept of circularity can also be applied in other sectors as well. So this is an example of an oil and gas sector where you can apply these 3 principles and the 10 strategies in different production processes and operational processes as well. I've given some examples of processes where the potential is very high to use circularity and circular sourcing, resource efficiency in digital. We talked about, Caroline talked about digital twins is again a concept that's currently available with the technology advancement and the 4IR, etc. It's for companies to absorb it, to kind of apply it in order for the benefit of not just your organization, your stakeholders, but also for the wider economy and the society. This also talks about recovery by products and waste using the carbon capture or the direct capture of carbon compression technology. These are some techniques that we adapted for achieving green energy as well in your production processes. This concept can also be applied in the processing sector, like the power and utilities. And these are again some examples, some processes that we have helped organizations to apply circularity in their operational environment using these 3 principles and 10 strategies. And similarly, another example is the metals and mining sector. So I've taken these 3 sectors as an example because about 14% of energy emissions, or the carbon dioxide emissions, are coming from this sector globally on this. So these are some examples of how these have been applied. These principles is not theory. These have been applied in organizations, and it's not only helped from a sustainability perspective, but also help them in their economics because of the recycling and reuse, and it also helps them in their profitability and the business business, or should I say, benefits which they kind of focus on this as well. Right. What are the next steps? For this to improve? I think there has to be what you're doing currently is not adequate. There has to be an enhancement of this to meet the targets which have been agreed. And much of this, globally and also in many parts of the world, if it comes from a regulation from the various bodies, as we see, it would be the adoption is much more faster than if it's not regulated. So I think the regulatory frameworks needs to be improved. There should be circularity principles embedded in the regulatory framework and to steer regulation policy. We are already seeing that in UK and certain other European countries. So it's important to strengthen the regulations across multiple sectors in order to enhance the adoption of circularity. Second, incentivize investments in circular economy for green companies through fiscal incentives or tax incentives, etc. Third, from a policy perspective, invest in infrastructure that will enable effective renewable energy integration, waste management, and backward logistics. So it provides the supporting ecosystem for the companies to adapt this more frequently. The fourth is to create independent circularity councils to advise industries and advance the development of standards and specifications, because this is a new concept. It's not something that's been far adapted as yet. So it's important to increase awareness, knowledge on this particular subject. So it's important to have those advisory support available for organizations who are hesitant to take that first step around the circularity area. Increase cross-country collaboration to explore optimization possibilities, such as jointly developing desalination plants in favorable locations. What we see is, UK has taken a lead as compared to other countries amongst achieving this. They've signed up, if I remember, on 2030 to achieve net zero. So I think we should follow the developed cities, countries, in order to kind of enhance the pace of achieving this circularity. Increase public awareness of the circular economy and its benefit, as I mentioned. And lastly, what should organizations do to achieve circularity? This shows about 6 recommendations, which is to look at it, look at your processes, look at your business internally through a different lens, in order to look at which are those processes, which are the pockets that you would have in your business to enhance circularity concepts, the principles and strategies that I just mentioned. Be clear about your strategy. At the end of the day, these should all be part of your overall strategy and vision. For example, in PwC, we kind of said we will achieve in a particular percentage of compliance as part of the ESG regulation, ESG requirement in a few years or so. So build that into your vision and strategy. So that you have a clear ambition and you have the KPIs and targets that get into the business ecosystem, and then that becomes part of BAU, which is your business as usual. Plan your circular transformation journey effectively. So some companies may need small steps, but it's important to have a clear strategy, target, operating model, and also the steps that you need to take to achieve circular compliant. Develop collaboration and frameworks from a circular perspective, have relationships, alliances with those entities that are already in it or that are supporting this particular journey, so that you can kind of rapid pace your drive along this area. Measure, review, as in any management requirement. You measure your progress, you review and communicate your progress as to the leadership, to the management, so that you are able to kind of comply and meet those requirements. And of course, this can also become a competitive advantage for you from a business perspective. In fact, many of the, your society would kind of recognize you to be the first one to move in this direction if you are kind of compliant and you kind of have your very clear defined goals around achieving the green environment. Move before your competitors, customers, and regulators do. So these are the 6 recommendations which which organizations could potentially adapt to get into the circular journey. So with this, I'll hand over back to Robert to take this forward. Thank you.
Nice, thank you very much indeed. If you could take your slides down, I'd be grateful. And I will ask all the speakers to come on with their cameras, and we will begin the next part of the session, which is the panel discussion. I've been told by the organisers we aren't able to feed in chat from around the world from those who are listening, but all the same, I have received one anonymous comment. So I'd like to start the panel discussion with that before I then throw some difficult questions at the panelists and see how we can get some answers from them. The comment in the chat is, and I don't know how many people can see this, but I'll read it because I think it's helpful, both as a thank you and as a question. It says, thank you to the speakers of this session for the clear and insightful presentations. I will do that. So just one question from that particular questioner is that, what can we learn from developing countries and low tech in terms of energy use, given they have limited energy supplies? Do that again. What can we learn from developing countries and low tech in terms of energy use, given they have limited energy supplies? So I'm sure all our speakers have something to say to that. But Nawaz, can I start with you? And would you like to respond briefly to that? And then we'll go around the table. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's important that, as I said before, it's important to learn from other entities, other countries, and geographies, and bring some good practices from these entities and apply it. So therefore, countries with low energy obviously would have, as part of their overall ecosystem, would look at renewable energy, look at different sources of energy in order to kind of meet their industrial requirements. So we kind of look at the various sources that they apply, in order to kind of meet the requirements. In addition to that, we should look at the regulations which these entities or the geographies have. And as I said, one of the fastest way of ensuring that the entities comply with these requirements is to bring it into your regulations. So you need to have a top-down approach, and countries we need to kind of take these regulations and customize it to your geography, and then apply that to your environment. And the third area which I'd like the organizations to look at is in terms of looking at practices and I'd say best practices, if I may say so, from these entities around applying circularity or equivalent measures in order to kind of meet the requirements. So these are the three things which I would take from the countries that have low energy requirements.
Thank you. Okay. Caroline, do you have anything you'd like to add to Nawaz's reply?
Sure. Yeah, I think first, particularly if you're thinking about developing countries, predominantly, obviously, a lot of their energy comes from hydropower, so obviously much more kind of renewable and sustainable, although there are obviously issues with climate around that as well that need to be tackled. The other interesting thing about obviously more developing countries is that they don't necessarily have all of the old and encumbered infrastructure that we have. And so actually an advantage in terms of building something that is more sustainable and fit for the future. So I think there's opportunities there. In terms of us learning from them, maybe I'll take a more cynical approach to that question. It's like, I think we should, but I think we're quite embedded in our ways in the West in terms of how we, how we function. And so that behavior change that would be required to kind of go back to a more minimal existence, I think would be, is the right thing to do, thinking more local, thinking more, self-generation. And I think that's where the direction we should be pushing in terms from a resilience perspective and a sustainable perspective. But I think the will needs to be there to do that. And, that's a big behavior change project.
Yeah, thank you. Andy?
I think I'd really build on what Caroline just said. I mean, I think one of the biggest areas for learning there is about local production and local consumption. So therefore, you're automatically strongly minimizing the greenhouse gas emissions associated with, for example, the food that we eat and the things that we consume, as part of our everyday lives in the West. I think we're starting to see people move towards that. I think, as Caroline said, it's a massive part of the behavioural change that needs to happen as we move towards a much more sustainable society for 2050. But getting people to spend more time on mass transport, again, something else which is more common in the developing world than it is in the Western world. So a number of the things that I think we touched on during our individual presentations have already been an established part of life, in terms of the active mobility as well, to what Caroline said around, if you can walk it, then walk it, or cycle it. It doesn't matter if it's raining a little bit, you're not going to dissolve. We can all make these changes which make quite a significant impact.
Oh, thank you very much. Good. Well, I hope that addresses the question that the questioner put. So let's move on to some more difficult questions, if I may, and I'll throw this to all of you, and you come back as you think appropriate. And it's really to pick up some of the comments you've already made. I'm interested to hear your ideas about the proportion, percentage, if you might, that technology will allow us to achieve the net zero targets of 2050 or earlier. Proportion in terms of other aspects of life. So as an example, what proportion of decarbonisation do you think could synthetic fuels or electric planes deliver against those other things you talked about, behavioural change? Flying, it would be less frequent flying, or regulation. We increase aviation fuel taxes. But what is the balance between the technology or technological solutions versus the other solutions of behaviour and regulation? Now, you would say it's a 50-50 or a 30-70 split. Interested to hear your views on how much technology is going to play in this solution. Whoever would like to start the this.
I can start this. I think I get it. It's a similar comment, isn't it? It's about I think it's easier for us to rely on technology to solve our problems rather than us have to change our behaviors. So I think in some ways people are holding out for technology is going to be the answer. But I think we just need to be careful we're not making more problems. And I think it is really important that we do change our behaviors. So I would say it's probably. I would like to see probably a 50% on technology, but a 50% on behaviour change, and that behaviour change is obviously prompted by policy, regulation, and really helping people understand what they can do to make a difference. So I think maybe a 50-50 there for me.
Good. Okay. Thank you, Andy.
I think from my perspective, I think the answer to this question would have been different pre-pandemic to post-pandemic. I think where we are now, for me, we're looking at the pandemic. If that had happened 10 years ago, when we were just relying on, Skype as it was in those days, the world would have been in a very different place to coping with it, as we've managed to do with Zoom and Teams and the other digital platforms that we're now much more used to. So, and I think as well, as we look at, all companies are now looking at their sustainability profile, their carbon footprint. And so I think we are going to see less flying from the industrial sector, the commercial sector, because so many of these meetings, particularly short ones, can be done very effectively using digital platforms. I think when you look at the decarbonisation pathways that, for example, the IAG, International Airlines Group, is taking, along with things like various countries' decarbonisation plans, their assumptions on behavioural change are very small, maybe 5 to 10% maximum. So while I'm an optimist by nature, my wife sometimes says to the point of delusion, but I'm an optimist by nature, and so I'd like to see us moving towards that 50-50 balance. But I think we will be relying on some of the things that Caroline mentioned and I touched on around sustainable aviation fuels. It's often around about 30 to 40% of the route to decarbonisation of the airline industry that's put forward by governments and by people like the IAG, with quite a bit of it actually just coming from carbon capture and storage, so offsetting basically. So I think that's the pathway that people are assuming, but I think post-pandemic we will see a greater proportion of behavioural change associated with it.
Thank you. Okay, Noah's.
Yeah, I think if you look at the future, the role of technology, in our lives itself would increase tremendously in multiples as what we had in the last 10, 20 years. So, electric cars is no longer a dream; it's reality. It's coming in. Digital twins, as Caroline mentioned before, is also something that's coming up, and it's going to be adapted in the future. So there's going to be a lot of adaptation by various sectors, and the technology influence will seep in, considerably compared to the past. And as Andy mentioned, post-pandemic, it's further accelerated the digitization and the transformation around it. So, I would expect, of course, the behavioral change is the toughest part of it, and I guess it requires the leadership and the commitment to kind of make that happen. But I would expect technology to play a larger role, maybe more than 50%, maybe around 60%, and mainly because of the fact that it's going to play an important or role in our lives going forward, and organizations have are left with no option but to go for digitization, because their competitors are doing it, the customers are demanding it, so it's getting more into our lives going forward.
Thank you. Well, those are interesting answers. We won't quote you in terms of your percentages and see whether you're right in 30 years' time, but thank you. Caroline, you wanted to come back?
Yeah, no, I thought that was a really important point that's been raised around the pandemic and how that's changed our behaviours. And I think there is a huge opportunity now for us to kind of keep that change and not go back to where we were, and to have that be a catalyst to kind of for permanent change. And I think that's really important. And I've actually got a question. So one of the things that, I think we've all noted is that, when risks such as pandemics are in our face, we tend to, react to them and deal with them. We've poured so much kind of effort into COVID, but actually when you think about COVID versus climate change is going to have a much bigger economic and people impact. And yet I don't feel like we're really in that sort of state of panic and really doing stuff about it. And so there's this perception, isn't there, around risk, about when people want to feel threatened and need to do something about it. And so I think that's one of the things we're trying to tackle, isn't it, in terms of getting that sense of urgency with these slower moving kind of issues. So I'd be interested in what the rest of our panel thinks about that.
We'll come on to that. Thank you. And just as a retort, absolutely agree with all you said, but it's interesting that post-pandemic, actually, people's concerns now are getting back to what they consider to be normality. Getting on a plane, going on holiday, and of course, for the economy and for jobs, that's critical. So we are seeing a counterbalance to an attempt to try and change behaviours. The pandemic has actually thrown that off course to a degree, is my contribution to it. Andy, yes, go ahead.
I think the other thing here, and we a number of us touched on it, is the role of policymakers here as well. So, for example, within the European Commission's Fit for 55 proposals, there are proposals there to mandate the use of sustainable aviation fuel and to increase that proportion over time. Which I think will help here. We've got organisations like Airbus, which again builds on one of the points that Caroline made, looking at, can we use hydrogen directly in planes? And then I think we've also got the big role of policymakers around, if we are going to be still moving relatively large distances, what is the lowest carbon way of doing that? Because oftentimes it's not flying. If you are looking at moving from, for example, I don't know, London to Edinburgh or something like that, let's make sure that we do have the rail infrastructure in place. It's a much lower carbon form of transporting large numbers of people around the place. And one of the things that I noted was the French government, when they've been helping Air France through the pandemic, is they've essentially mandated that Air France no longer fly between Paris and Marseille, because you can get there as quickly using the HGV, using high-speed rail. So the role of policymakers in modal shift can also help us if we are going to be traveling, reasonably long distances, let's say, 500 kilometers or so. There's often a lower carbon way of doing that than getting on a plane as well.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'd like to move the conversation on because we've got limited time left, and I'll throw in another really difficult one. Greta Thunberg's blah, blah, blah speech recently made much of politicians' statements on policies and strategies, but criticised practical actions in play. Reflecting the UK, where I'm from, for instance, the government's produced an energy plan, a green industry plan, a North Sea oil plan, a transport decarbonisation plan, a hydrogen plan. The details of how we realise these good intentions are sketchy, to say the least. So what does the panel think about technologies helping to accelerate these deliverables? Once we have a plan, getting the technologies embedded. What's your view on that? So can we go around the room? Who would like to start? Andy, please do.
Yeah, I think again, there's a big role for policymakers here, and if we look at, for example, we'll stay parochial for a moment, looking at what's going on in the UK, for example, as part of the hydrogen strategy, the government is now consulting with industry and with many others around how can we, what is the best way to define, for example, low carbon hydrogen. What is the best way to incentivize its production and use? So looking at business models and things, building on one of the things that Nawaz said, there's a big role for business models to incentivize early production, early uptake, and really to get that spiraling, the spiraling of costs coming down. So I think, technology is going to play an absolutely critical role in enabling us to achieve the ambitions that we've got. I think also within the UK, in some ways, we are leading the world with the Climate Change Committee and the carbon budget policies that we have, which are legally binding. And so, there's the government is being held to account by the Climate Change Committee around pathways. What are we doing? And every time that there's a new report issued, this is the balance, this is the way that we need to use incoming technologies and existing technologies to enable to meet these challenging carbon budgets, which obviously end up in a net zero position in 2050. So I think there's a role for policymakers there. I think the other thing that I'll say on this is that big corporates have also got a massive role to play in this. When you look at VW, for example, VW advertised their ID3 electric vehicle as coming from a zero carbon flow sheet. There's never been an advert on British TV like that in the past. They're offsetting, but what they're doing is they're putting a lot of pressure on their suppliers to enable VW to minimize the offsets that are required, the carbon offsets that are required to make that truly zero carbon. And so they've told LG Chem in Poland that, yes, you can make the battery cells in Poland as long as you use renewable electricity to make them, which in turn impacts on government policy in Poland if they want to continue to attract clean industries. So I think there's policymakers and governments and things like that. There's a big role for them. But I think also, a number of big companies and their supply chains will drive this through, which will also accelerate some of the aspects of circularity that Nawaz mentioned as well, making sure that we are moving much more towards a circular economy by using much more, by recycling much more of what we consume, what we would otherwise consume.
Thank you. Yeah, Caroline, Nawaz?
Sure. Yeah. So I think that's a really good point in terms of, I think there are a lot of plans out there in terms of this is the goal we want to achieve and this is, what we want to do, but there's not a lot in terms of how we're going to get there. And I think that's the difficult part, isn't it? And it's great that we have commitment and we have a target, but the real hard work starts now in terms of actually getting to that point. And so I think, and as somebody, a consultant who does quite a lot of plans, I do get quite frustrated with actually what we need to do is implement these plans. And so I tend to spend more time now thinking about, well, how do you do that? And I'm going to go back to my behavior change piece, which is basically about, targeting individuals in cities, organizations, communities, about making it real for them in terms of what can I do to meet that goal? And that's kind of ultimately how you get that shift up that whole kind of ladder. And so I think that's a really key piece that needs to be done. The other thing I will say is, as at Arapan Resilience Shift, we're obviously trying to make it practical for people. So, okay, from an infrastructure perspective, what does that mean in terms of, what steps need to be taken? And so we're very much working on very practical guidance in terms of, okay, this is what you need to do first, then you do this. And so kind of we're working on for example, a climate adaptation plan for infrastructure at the moment with the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure. And so we're trying to kind of make it real in terms of, okay, what does that mean? The other aspect going back to previous kind of conversations we were having was, in order to change, everyone needs to change. And so again, it's kind of trying to bring together these different sectors around the table to kind of collaborate and really come together on what do each other need to do and how does that kind of interact. And so that's another thing that we try and do at the Resilience Initiative, just bringing together those relevant entities to do that. And so I think those are key in terms of technology, which I haven't mentioned. Obviously, that is a key. That's key too. And I think Andy was right on the mark there in terms of the policy, in terms of how that can incentivize. I think, going back to his comment about skills development as well, I think that's going to be incredibly important. We're already seeing skill shortages in the UK, in the supply chains, and it's, we're doing some work in the rail sector right now, and it's like skills is going to be a massive, to modernize the industry, skills and decarbonize. So I think, definitely a lot of things need to change there.
Yeah, thank you. Noah, any further comments?
Yeah, I think great points raised by Andy and Caroline. So I'd just like to add on those, which is to say that from my perspective, I believe technology is an enabler, right? So as long as there is a commitment from the policymakers, technology can kind of achieve the world or even beyond. So it's important that the policymakers who define those policies have that. I would say have that commitment of putting in a governance system to enable and implement the policies that they have defined. I think that's where perhaps there needs to be a bit more, I would say, lens by these policymakers, because they do the policies and that's not the end of the road. That's actually the beginning of the action. So that's not the end, right? So that's just the beginning. So you need to focus, and that's not just at the government policy level. It happens at the organizations. They come up with great strategies and policies, etc. But on the ground, it doesn't have that much impact. So it's a question of applying tools to put together an ecosystem of measuring the performance of various industries. So, you have the industry bodies, industry sectors, to help them accountable from the policy to say, this is what you need to achieve, and measure them using KPIs year over year. And then they will bring technologies to make it work. It's something that will happen, it'll, rather than a push, it'll happen by a pull by them looking at technologies. And from a technology perspective as well, there is technologies available for removing carbon dioxide from air and then converting that into other chemicals, resins, example, for manufacturing, etc. There are multiple technologies available. I would say it's a question of the leadership or the policymakers to kind of shift the dial from policy making as well into stronger governance around measuring the performance of the various entities.
Thank you, Andy.
Yeah, I think I'd like to come back on a couple of things that have been said, and also building on what Caroline said about incentivizing people. One of the roles of technology, the better we get at technology, the more the costs come down. So within, for example, the next 3 or 4 years, an electric vehicle without subsidy would be the same price as an internal combustion engine powered vehicle. You hit that tipping point, and then this is a way to accelerate the uptake of those technologies. And I think building on the economics point, it's actually now cheaper in more than half of the world to build and operate a renewable energy power plant than it is to continue operating existing fossil fuel powered plants. And an example we've seen of that in the US is that at the moment, when you look at the US energy provision, natural gas is still number 1, renewables are number 2, nuclear is number 3, and coal, remarkably, and 10 years ago, I didn't think I'd be saying that, is number 4. And that's actually not been driven by policy, that's been driven by economics. Yeah. But it comes from technology, it comes from technology uptake, it comes from us getting smarter and bringing the costs down, so that these then become, it's not the green choice, it's just the economic choice as well. And the more we move towards that with the use of technology, we get into this virtuous circle.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Thank you. And I hope Greta would be empowered by your comments, and certainly not rate her blah, blah, blah comments. So thank you for those very good answers. Let's move on to a different concept. And I'm trying here to link another resource, which we really haven't mentioned so far, and that's water, and connected to technology. We all know that billions of microchips are produced every year worldwide. Yes, I found an interesting fact that and I can't verify it, but it's what I've been told, just one microchip takes 30 litres of water to which means that the average semiconductor factory, which turns out millions of them, uses as much water as a town of 50,000 people a year. So as the world continues to sort of digitally transform at pace, with microchips being central to that journey, can we really match this conflict between the technology advance and the resources that demand it? And I think this goes back to Mohammed's circular economy point. But Mohammed, would you like to tackle that specific one on the back of what you talked about as a circular economy?
Yeah, I think this is a perfect example of applying the circular concept into the business model for such entities, right? So the question is, how can we take a fixed quantity of your resource and see how we can kind of reuse, recycle, etc., and invest more on that, so that you can get more out of a fixed quantity of resource, in this particular case water, to get that. So that's one. The second is look at this whole process and then see, from using research and development, what's the more efficient, sustainable and green way of manufacturing those microchips. I'm not sure if they have looked at it in that level of detail, because there is available resource, so they've gone ahead with kind of what they have done and been working successfully. But now with the current constraints that we have, with the requirements that we have, so how can they relook at the process, the engineering, and through the R&D, and see how they can more efficiently, kind of manufacture these chips, and also maybe better using an alternate resource as well. So I think these are two things that we would they need to look at, and that would again not come in unless there is a regulation, there's a push from the top, from these industries, to kind of relook at their manufacturing cycle.
Yeah, no, thank you very much indeed. Caroline or Andy, any comments on that? Andy? I
think, yeah, perhaps, building on what Noah said, I think this is not just a problem for the semiconductor industry, right? This really is a global challenge. And so back to one of the central recommendations around this cross-sector coupling, getting sectors to look at things more holistically. There's plenty that can be done to minimize water use in lots of other areas as well. It comes back to the use of technology, further R&D to develop it. So I think for me, these questions are generally better answered, if you can, in that cross-sector way, breaking down the silos and making sure that people are looking at using only what they need, and then always looking for what is the next leap in technology which can enable me to further minimize either the amount that I use or the amount that I can effectively recycle, maybe through a purification step, and then sending it back into the beginning of the process again.
Yeah, thank you. Caroline, any further comments on that one?
I mean, I think it's been well covered. I totally agree, particularly around the systems thinking, because all these things are interconnected. And so it's so vital that we're thinking in terms of systems and understanding the dependencies and the impact between the industries, but also in terms of the outcomes, in terms of sustainability, resilience, and all the whole kind of all of those issues.
Good. Okay. Well, we're coming to the end of the session, so I'll fire one last question to you, and if you could briefly come back with your thoughts on it. It's an interesting one, and I absolutely respect that none of us are meteorologists, but is climate data at the city scale rather than the country scale or nation scale sufficient really to inform business strategy and investment decisions around decarbonisation and technology? And sort of to preempt some of your answers, perhaps, is, we may have the data and we've been warned of the data and the disasters that are pending. The trouble is people haven't got the imagination or the urgency to use that data and do something about it. But the point I'm making here is at city scale. Do we have enough information to be able to tell people, in a postcode, that flood is coming and do something about it? But then again, devil's advocate, they were warned from the European flood awareness system that there was a flood coming in Germany, very precisely which rivers and which towns, but they didn't take any action. So could I just ask for your comments briefly about the mismatch between data the scale of it and our capability to respond to it appropriately. Whoever would like to start.
I could just briefly start. I mean, I think we do have enough data, and obviously we're using, remote sensing tools, satellite data, geospatial data. And so, for example, we're doing a project in Uzbekistan at the moment, and we're mapping kind of risk and climate risk, future risk across the city. So we do have that data, but I think the disconnect here is that we're not necessarily using that data to inform planning or inform decision making, and obviously we're trying to do that with our clients, but there's still definitely a disconnect there.
Thank you. And have you got any thoughts, Caroline, how you remove that disconnect very briefly?
Well, again, it's about information informing stakeholders about why they need to pay attention to it and what they need to do about it. And so I think a lot of it is an impotence, because it's just such a big problem, I don't know what I can do about it. So I think you need to turn it down to, this is the information, this is what it means to you, this is what you can do about it. And I think that's the key, really.
Okay, thank you. Andy?
Yeah, I agree with Caroline. I mean, I think the data's there. I think it's all about driving the right responses and putting it in a context of, so what, this is why it matters to you. These are the consequences if you don't act. And I think, one of the things that we've seen a lot of over the last 10 years is, for example, mayors of big cities wanting to deliver, just to give an example, cleaner air to all of their citizens. And therefore, we're seeing public transport fleets migrating from internal combustion engines to battery power and hydrogen power and things like that. And I think, that's the kind of route, get that kind of dialogue. Dirty air, particularly smoggy air, it's very, very visible. The threat of something that is maybe perceived as a bit nebulous, it's more difficult to get people to respond on that. And it's often only after the first flood that the adaptation really starts on that. So I think we just need to get smarter about, making it clear, as Caroline said, why this is important. This is what you can do about it, and this is what you really should do about it to protect your citizens. And from the mayor's perspective, if you want to get re-elected, this is actually quite a big deal.
Yeah. Do you think there's a valid point about lack of imagination in people not realizing the potential damage that can come their way, because they've never experienced it before? We're in a new era of climate change, and people have never seen these floods or this disaster before, and they can't even get their head around it.
I think sorry to interrupt, but I was going to say, I mean, I think where communities have seen it before, they respond. You look at New Orleans, post Katrina, something else comes through, and the roads are jammed with people getting away because they know how bad it can be. Whereas, as you mentioned, cities in Germany not used to it. Second time, people will move a lot quicker. Yeah. But we've got to get away from that. We've got to be proactive rather than reactive, so that people's lives are not being lost and livelihoods being ruined.
That was the point I was trying to arrange earlier, was this kind of, when it's not real for you, or it doesn't feel like an immediate threat, it's very difficult to kind of want to do something about it, and that's what we need to get over.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, as you have the last word in about a minute.
I think it's a human tendency that people act only when they see the kind of risk in front of their face. So as a resilience practitioner, we have been speaking to organizations, look at resilience, continuity, recovery, etc., etc. But nobody, very few took action. Now came COVID, and then we opposed that. Many of the organizations say, "Wow, I want to do this. I want to do this." So it's the same thing is applicable here as well. So in terms of this question of not there's more data than less. The question is, what do you make sense out of the data? Number one. And in the region, you have an example of a country, Lebanon, which is basically currently they don't have enough power to meet their requirements, energy to meet their requirements. This is, I'm sure, with a little bit of a it's not a data issue. It's not. It's a policy and aspect. Aspects like that. So I believe it's not a data issue. It's a question of commitment, policy, and taking the right governance and leadership, which will enable this to be addressed. So that's my view on this.
Good. No, thank you. Thank you so much. And it only leaves me in the last minute really of this session to thank you all for giving some really insightful presentations and insightful discussions and answering some difficult questions. And I think overall we all generally agree on the direction of travel, whether it's a 50-50 technology behavior split or it's 70-30. It will be fascinating to see how it emerges. I'm sure it will be somewhere in between those two. But thank you very much for putting your words into effect here and your extremely helpful presentation. So it only leaves me on behalf of Resilience First and the organisers of the conference, UN Habitat and the Global Mayors arrangement to give this conference some lift. And I hope the audience who've listened to it this morning feel likewise. So I will close and thank you once again for listening. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks for having us. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.